Right, and now it is back to the 90s.
Woohoo!
The decade. So, do we disremember the decade, and why was it so important to our culture and politics? So for this, we're going to be leaning into Miranda's expertise, plus I'll be answering a few more questions, as Jacob and Rachel don't really have sufficient first-hand experience of the 90s, which is unbelievable.
I feel like I do. Maybe we can discuss that.
Maybe we should. So I guess obviously it all begins in 1990, but I think does the whole thing of the 90s begin in 1989 when we had that kind of end of history point and Berlin Wall's come down, end of the Cold War. This was victory of liberal democracy. Everything was going to be great from there on in. Is that what lay beneath that sort of sense of hope that went through the decade?
That's quite interesting. I mean, yeah, maybe. I mean, I do remember that very clearly. I mean, it depends, again, if your touch points are culture or not. So I can remember the very start of 1990 that we had, this is going to sound ludicrous, but, it's the kind of thing that I believed in. Number ones were very important. The single, there was a string of really brilliant hits. And it felt like we had won. Do you know what I mean? So it felt like we had Adamski, we had Madonna's Vogue, we had Nothing Compares to You, we had Snap and The Power, we had lots of kind of really amazing songs. It felt like kind of rave music was coming in and we were winning, right? It was then followed by like Elton John and Timmy Mallet doing Bomba Lurina and Nixie Bitsy Teeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini. So like it wasn't a winner, but it felt a little bit like youth culture was winning at that point, and then it felt it even more at other points during the decade. And those were the things that gave me positivity, because I think this happens all the time, that youth culture bubbles away and does its own thing. It's quite rare that youth culture is able to take over the mainstream. It's normally, if it's alternative culture, it's just allowed to bubble around the edges. And when it manages to take over the mainstream, that's an incredible feeling. And it does happen. I mean, it happened even with things like, say, grime and Stormzy. When that Stormzy became like the king of the world, that's quite a big deal. That came out of alternative culture. And it happens every so often. And in the 90s, that happened. And that was a point, with Blur, Oasis, all those kind of bands becoming hugely mainstream, where you would actually have thought that they would have been a bit more like My Bloody Valentine, that they would have just been around the edges and wouldn't have really hit so hard. When that happens, you feel like, things are changing. It's really exciting. This is absolutely fantastic. We're kind of winning. I mean, then, of course, you get smacked down again, but you can have those moments, and that's incredibly exciting.
Is there anything sort of structural beneath that? Is there anything in like how the record companies were working, which meant that you had some things floating to the top, which, why then and not in the previous decade?
It's so many weird architectures. So basically, there was money from CDs. So CDs had come in towards the end of the 80s, and they were really expensive. They were like 15 quid. And of that, like a quid went to the artist. So like the record companies were making
it's really expensive. You wonder now whether people pay £15 frequently, because I used to buy a lot.
What's interesting now is that people buy vinyl is really what they call vinyls. Vinyl is really expensive, so that's like 30 quid, and CDs are like 8. So it's like it's around the other way. But the record companies had a lot of money because of that, right? And then there were a lot of kind of indie bands and an indie scene that could bubble because there was cheap rents
and venues,
all those things.
The grassroots venues, massive.
That were like, that those existed. So they could kind of plug into the record companies by saying, we've got an indie company, can we just have some of your money and we'll do your A&R? Like we'll form this great little company, and then if we use your money, it kind of funnels through to you, and then you can think of that with like Food Records was like that, Creation was like that. Those kind of little bands really, really helped. And then I think that the music press was really important, which sounds a bit weird because obviously I was from the music press, so it's a bit like we were really important. But pre-social media, the music press was like really slow Twitter. So that like, there was constant arguments and constant hypes and constant discussions about things that you were really interested in that you had to be engaged with, and they would be like hyping up of a certain band and then slamming down. It was
they'd have big fallouts between the bands.
Yeah, and that was kind of quite important. And obviously that disappeared at the end of the 90s. there was only the NME left. Select had gone, the Face had gone, the Melody Maker had gone. All that had gone because of the internet. So there was just a kind of architecture around it that helped the music industry. Do you know what I mean?
With that as well, obviously the music press is one thing, but do you think the news media as well, did that make it seem... Because I think of... my impression from 90s politics, I was, 5 when Tony Blair came into power.
So you were born in 1992, I was born in 1990.
Yeah. But like Tony Blair was just politics when I was growing up, and politics was just kind of boring and over there.
Yeah, background
and
noise.
Sort of my parents had voted for Tony Blair, but weren't that happy about it, didn't really care that much around it. Is that the thing that like the scandals that we see, were they sort of simultaneously inflated but also kind of allowed to be over quicker and dealt with, if that makes sense, because it wasn't the sort of 24-hour news rolling scandal that you see at the moment? Did that slow politics down? Was politics actually always as grubby as it is now, but we just didn't quite get it because you had to wait for the next day?
I don't know whether it slowed it down. In many ways, I think it kind of extended it because people's attention spans, I think, were slightly longer. So if there was a big scandal, it was front page day after day after day. And remember as well, at that point, you had Sunday newspapers which really broke big stories, be it the Sunday Times or the News of the World. And they would come out with something, and you could buy them on a Saturday night, and that would be the story that would define the news agenda.
Yeah.
But I do think it's really interesting what you're saying about, Blair was the big... So for me, I was coming up for 9 when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. And so all that kind of time of growing up and becoming politically conscious was all under Thatcher. And then into my 20s, you had John Major. And so it's hard to understate what a moment 1997 was. So I'd gone from being 8 to being nearly 27 under Tory rule. And that day,
me the same, exactly.
It was an incredible day, and I'd been at the count in Hove, and Hove obviously went to Labour, and that was a big thing, obviously, because very sort of posh, and I was working down there, and it was and the morning after the election, it really was a clear blue sky. And it really felt like anything was possible. It was an extraordinary day.
Yeah,
it
was.
This politics aspect to it. Like Alison, you started off by saying that you don't really think that I count as someone who can remember the 90s. And you were totally right in that, like, at the millennium, I was 9. So, like, political awakenings hadn't really happened. But I think of myself as being a child of the 90s because I think of the 90s starting really in 1997 with Blair. And I think of it going on until round about 2007, 2008 with the crash, when it started sort of, when basically the decades of everything is going to be shit forever started. And in age terms, that takes me from being 9 to being 17, which is a pretty, that is sort of childhood into adolescence, age of innocence kind of thing. And it, in terms of geopolitics, it felt a bit of the age of innocence. We could all have nice things forever and ever and ever. We'd solved diversity. We'd solved multiculturalism. So I'm interested in both of your opinions on whether it's kind of accurate that the 90s carries on past the millennium in both cultural and political terms.
I think culturally, no, because it changes. It actually, weirdly, when Blair gets in, I mean, if you're talking like things like inverted commas Britpop, like when Blair gets in, it turns into Cool Britannia and it's just terrible. And then, like,
so the Spice Girls are not 90s for you?
The Spice Girls are fine. The Spice Girls exist in their own world. That's fine. I have no problem with the Spice Girls. But in terms of kind of like indie alternative culture, everyone apart from Oasis went, oh my God, this is absolutely terrifying being famous, and they all back off, basically. And then Coldplay take over and Travis take over, and we have to wait for the Strokes to change everything back to being good again. So I do think that kind of like there's a tailing off of the culture, I would say. Chris Evans, I can't stand Chris Evans, takes over. And that is not.
Was that late 90s then? Would you say Chris Evans?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of mid 90s into the late 90s. He just takes over.
Yeah, he was everywhere.
Yeah, he was everywhere, and that is not a good thing for culture.
No,
like, absolutely not. He kills the 90s as well. So I think that culturally it kind of shifts a little bit, but I can see. I mean, I'm really interested that, like, if you were young and right up to the point where you're just about to, like, launch yourself in the world, and then it all goes to shite. That's just terrible.
And then it never recovers. And
that's
the thing for people who are
rubbish.
but that's the thing for sort of millennials now, is that, like, there was the financial crash, and then there was austerity, and then there was Brexit, and then there was sort of COVID, and now we're just like, okay, when do we get a break? That's how
when's
you
the
feel,
good
right?
bit?
Did 9/11 over here feel like a break in the same way? Because I obviously speak to a lot of people in America, and it seems to me like that 2001 was when the 90s ended for them because of that. And I wonder, actually, I remember being sent home from school when that happened, and I remember weirdly we'd laid a plaque at school about 9/11. They asked me to write a poem about it. I'd love to read that poem now. I'm sure it was not great, but did that feel like a moment, or then was there? Did we care about America as much
I
then?
think
Did we
with
focus on it
slightly
in the
less
same way?
9/11, but the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, I think that those wars,
that changed a lot.
They changed everything, because also there was so much public opposition
Okay.
that was overruled or ignored.
My mum and dad went on the march
Yeah.
against the Iraq War, and they are not marchers. I mean, they're
It was
liberal
huge,
people, but they
huge.
never went on the march, and they were really, really upset about it. But I think it was like the 9/11 was an event. I mean, it was miles away, and it was terrifying, and it was awful, but it was like a kind of rolling news event.
Yeah.
Almost
Yes,
like
like Diana dying. It
yes,
was like
exactly.
that. Yeah.
And so that was something that you, like, it didn't quite affect you, but you knew it was a thing. Maybe you would buy the paper for that day. Do you know what I mean? It was like awful. But then there were, with 9/11, obviously there were political consequences, and that kind of, it did wreck everything, didn't it? Really?
I think it did, and it just sort of somehow sucked the joy out of things that then continued, like you say, into the financial crisis.
So if I'm not a child of the 90s, am I still allowed to like pulp?
You are definitely pulp. Yeah, I mean, yes, of course. Jarvis is our god.
But I went to see Pulp the other week, actually, and I was quite surprised how much I'd forgotten about the joy that does come from that music. And I was also forgot how much the music I really knew, but I'd forgotten as well.
I saw them in Finsbury Park a couple of years
So
ago.
good.
It was so good. It was probably the best gig I've ever been to.
Yeah.
And it was half people in their 40s and 50s and half people my age and younger. And it was like everyone together.
And it was a
wonderful.
really good show, wasn't
And
it?
everyone knew all the words.
Yes,
Yeah.
quite right.
Did people do sort of more accidental politics than they realised in the 90s, Miranda? Kind of with rave, for example, I don't imagine at the time that you thought this is a political action I'm taking in. But now you look at rave when people will go and do sort of abandoned warehouse gigs or whatever else like that, or like hardcore music that I'm into that's into like really small grassroots venues. It's really heavily people are sort of going, well, yeah, I go to this because it's a political point to go to these now, which almost slightly... it's kind of breaking the fourth wall a little bit. But do you think that were you aware that there was a sort of politics to it?
Well, there was
perhaps
definitely
accidentally?
politics because it actually got legislated against, and that's the thing that we might have thought, okay, we're just raving,
Yeah.
But there was the Criminal Justice Act that came along. I mean, it literally banned repetitive beats. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So that it was legislated against as though it was political. So the Tories were still in power, and the Tories were obviously worried about a lot of young people all getting together, and they weren't really worried about the safety. The safety aspect was kind of fine. They were just worried about a lot of young people getting together. What could happen from that? And I mean, actually, what happened was that the licensing laws got changed. Really, that's what happened. You didn't used to be able to go out after 2:00, and that got changed. And drinking got changed because all the alcohol lobby were really worried because nobody was drinking anymore. So they
That's why they
introduced-
invented shots.
Yes, shots and alcopops.
And alcopops.
Because you could hold them. And so, those things changed. But I don't actually... There was definitely an element, like a kind of, I mean, what we used to call crusties element that were definitely kind of free parties. And they were like anarchists, really. That was an element to it, without a doubt. But most people were just raving. Really. It was just that what was interesting to me that it was treated like a kind of political act. And perhaps it was. I mean, getting together with people is a political act, isn't it? But it's like, I don't think that people did it for the politics.